Good evening and welcome everyone. We are honored to have with us Dr. James Dyson and Richard Ramsbotham. Yesterday was a significant day for us. After 15 months of war in Israel, three kidnapped young girls held captive since October 7th returned home from Hamas tunnels. We are excited but deeply concerned about their well-being and the situation of other hostages, of course. Today's lecture on the awakening of the soul, the birth of the I, and the courage for the truth is so relevant. Dr. James Dyson is an adult educator specializing in anthroposophic medicine, psychology, and psychosomatics. He lectures frequently within the anthroposophic movement. A medical doctor since 1975, he co-founded Park Atwood Clinic in 1979, where he worked with a multidisciplinary team for 25 years. Dr. Dyson completed training and earned a master's degree in psychosynthesis psychology in 2013. Yes, is it? Yeah. Richard Ramsbotham, okay, is an esteemed writer and theater director based in Stroud. He has authored numerous articles on contemporary events and has translated all four of Steiner's mystery dramas. Additionally, he co-manages Fourfold Living Arts, an initiative that integrates the performing art with significant cultural matters and current events. We appreciate James and Richard's willingness to deliver a lecture on this topic for our benefits. We see it as a, I think, reflection of our ongoing friendship. Thank you for your contributing to the anthroposophical community in Israel. James and Richard, the stage is yours.
Okay. Great. Well, I'm going to start and speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then James will take over. And as you saw, we've spoken about this particular moment in Steiner's mystery dramas, which happens in ancient Egypt, which I'm just going to sort of depict really and speak about the significance of it, and James will take it over and relate it to, how it speaks to us today, as it were. When asked to speak, I'm a bit nervous. I have been to Israel once, but it was a long time ago. I went to Harduf for 10 days or so, but it's for someone who's not there, I think they would be mad to try and say anything about the situation that you have. I mean, it's unimaginable, to be honest, from England to speak directly into your situation. So I make no attempt to do so. However, as Narita said, it's pretty extraordinary times. Even if we have to be really sober and really awake, they are, it's a quite odd moment for this talk. I don't think it was planned that way, that there was the ceasefire came to effect yesterday, and literally just ending now is Trump's inauguration. I managed to watch quite a bit of it, just, now, basically. So it is a certain moment, all of it, which, is open, is wide open what happens. And I think we need to be very sober and very awake, and, hopefully there are positives, but it's not a given at all. And this scene, one of the reasons I've recently directed the fourth, Steiner's last mystery drama, which is, rightly seen as the one with the most contemporary relevance. It's based in a factory, people trying to transform sort of on the ground situation in current civilization. And what's very odd is in the middle of it, this factory fails. I'm not going to go into the story, but the attempt to transform this factory doesn't work. And to cut a long story short, the whole play ends up in the middle with all the characters back in the, about 3,000, hang on a minute. Sorry, about 1400 BC in ancient Egypt. So with Egyptian culture having slightly going into decadence, but nonetheless with all the characters in an initiation scene in a previous life in ancient Egypt. And you kind of go, well, what's this about? And the extraordinary thing is that, I'll describe it a bit. The initiation goes wrong, in inverted commas, but it's actually the sort of catalyst for the block that had happened with all the characters to sort of unblock and for the rest of the play, even though they go through trials, they come through them and it sort of steps up. So there's like this knot in the play, which a sort of karmic knot, which goes back to ancient Egypt. And not only that, but during the First World War, some of you may know Rudolf Steiner had a friend, Emil Molt, who ran a cigarette factory, who funded the Waldorf schools. And Emil Molt sent tins of cigarettes out to the soldiers on the front. And he put in works of literature or spiritual works so that the people, one has to say it, many of whom would have been about to die, actually had some spiritual nourishment together with the cigarettes. And Molt also asked Rudolf Steiner if he would like to put something in there. And he put in two things. One was the calendar of the soul, which, is a very uplifting and understandable. And the other is this Egyptian initiation scene, where the whole initiation goes wrong. And it's like, how is this meant to help someone, which maybe we're all a bit like a soldier at the front, and you receive this really difficult initiation. So that, I took that up in a way as a bit of a challenge into whatever our situation is today, that there's something in this scene that speaks to us. And yeah, so briefly, very briefly, there's actually two scenes in ancient Egypt. And the first one has the Hierophant. There's a highest Hierophant who doesn't say very much, certainly at the beginning. And then there's the Hierophant, sorry for the crude analogy, but it's a bit more the kind of prime minister rather than the president. He's on the ground, the Hierophant, having to hold the whole situation. And it's a short scene, the first scene, but the Hierophant knows that there's something wrong. That the neophyte who's about to undergo the initiation is not ready to go through an initiation. But none of the other priests will say anything about it. They're just going ahead. It's just what happens. And there's this one character who goes through a bit of a monologue, which is quite unusual in ancient Egypt, who says, why am I the only one here who understands there's something wrong? And he's the one in charge of the whole ceremony as well. So that's the pre-scene. And then we go into the scene itself of the initiation. And, it's quite interesting because I'm sure many of you know that Rudolf Steiner says that in the present age, there's a kind of echo or a mirror back to the what he calls the third post-Atlantean epoch, the time of ancient Egypt. In some places he calls it the ancient Egyptian, Chaldaic, Assyrian, Judaic culture. So it's where many cultures, including in your own neck of the woods, are active. That there's a mirror there in relation to our own time. And yeah, so we go back there, and I'm sure there's many people today, probably not among all of you good people, but who would think, wow, if there's like an ancient Egyptian initiation scene, this would be wonderful. This is just what the kind of thing many people are looking for. Well, Steiner, it looks like he's going to satisfy what they're looking for, and then of course he absolutely doesn't satisfy it. But so the whole first part is very standard. It goes through absolutely rhythmical standard stages, through, you know, an opening speech, through the elements, through the soul forces, you know, everything's prepared. And then it comes to a certain point where the neophyte is meant to go, leave the soul realm and come into direct spiritual experience, and is meant to speak what he experiences there. And he says nothing. And the highest hierophant is horrified. You know, it's a bit like King Lear, if you know it. It's like nothing, you know. And then finally, the neophyte sort of comes to himself and sort of says the opposite of what the initiation was meant to be. So the initiation is meant to be really going up into the spiritual world, leaving the body and describing that experience. And what he describes is looking down on his body and having this great longing to be in the body. And then eventually coming into it and feeling this joy in actually life on earth. And for the priests, it starts off with the highest hierophant. This is an abomination. They all cry out, sacrilege. You know, this is just not okay. And then one of the priests turns on the hierophant, you know, who's had these worries at the beginning. And this other one says, it's your fault, to the hierophant. You were the one who were meant to have spoken into him, thought into him what he would then say. And you didn't do it. So, you know, one of them was aware that this hierophant actually deliberately did not do something he was meant to do. And the hierophant steps forward and says, yes, that's correct. That's exactly what happened. I'll read you his words. I did hold back from thinking on the words that I am bidden to by custom, which from my thinking should have passed across to the neophyte. The young man, therefore, has not proclaimed the thinking of another. He has proclaimed here his own being. Truth has conquered. I feel the times approach already which will set free the individual I from out the spirit of the group and grant it thinking of its own. And he kind of says, you might kill me, you know, maybe this neophyte goes off, but truth has conquered. And Rudolf Steiner did something quite extraordinary. He gave the Eurythmists on the stage a gesture that he'd never given before. And it's called Die Wahrheit siegt, truth has conquered, which they make at this moment. So it's on the one hand, there's this sacrilege, and on the other hand, there's this incredible moment of truth has conquered. And then everybody cries out at the hierophant, you know, more sort of sacrilege, he has to be punished. And then at the very end, you know, where you don't quite know what's going to happen, suddenly the sphinxes, so these stone sphinxes, which we've all seen pictures of, maybe you've been there, speak. And they speak as Lucifer and Ahriman. And then the highest hierophant goes, you know, something's happened here that hasn't happened for millennia. Nobody could just say something's gone wrong. I mean, something has gone wrong, but something's happened that's totally new. So that's the scene that kind of unlocks, as I say, this sort of block in the whole, this factory they're trying to do, which is held back by kind of, let's just call them retarding forces. There's a manager in this factory who says, sorry, we're just doing it in the old way. I'm not having any newfangled spiritual ideas or trying to, you know, bring in artistic ideas and spiritual knowledge. This is a factory and we're doing it the old way. And that's blocked the whole process. And after this, what re-experiencing this event in Egypt, it unblocks. So just for 5 minutes at the end, I just want to talk a little bit about what is happening here, and then James can take it further. One thing which is fascinating for those who are fascinated by this kind of thing is that Rudolf Steiner himself said to one of the eurythmists, he was telling this eurythmist about how to make this gesture of this truth has conquered. And Steiner said, you see, this scene is a quite decisive, concrete picture that is written into the Akashic Chronicle. It is that moment in which, for the first time, an initial sign lights up of the approaching Greek culture. And consequently, the awakening really has to happen like a call. Yeah, that's what the eurythmists had to do. So that's something. Yeah, he's saying it's actually a moment in the Akashic record which is depicted in this scene. But then it's also extremely interesting because Steiner, if any of you know his mystery dramas, you know, they're complex, they're incredible, but they are difficult. And many times people asked Steiner to explain something, and he always said, no, I'm not going to do it. You know, I didn't think them out. You know, they were inspired. I'm not going to fall into the trap of trying to explain things. And maybe it's not quite true, but almost the only time I know that he kind of disobeys that rule is in what he must have sent to the soldiers, because it's just a little explanation of the scene, which, you know, it was wonderful to find it, because, you know, I think for anybody to find the scene just by itself would be a bit difficult. And he gives a little explanation of what it's about. I'll read you the end of it. The Hierophant, well, he talks about the Egyptian cultural age having fallen into decadence. The Hierophant recognizes that a new time must dawn. The other leaders, the other priests, remain in the forms that have been handed down to them. They wish to lead the neophyte. Just slightly retranslate it. It's too bad. I just have to go with it. Sorry, it should be a bit clearer. They wish to lead the neophyte in keeping with the handed down forms into experience of the spiritual world. It is of no concern to them whether the pupil is really mature enough. Their concern is only that their forms should live on. The Hierophant crosses their intentions in that through his behavior, he ensures that the immaturity of the pupil will be revealed. Through this, he brings about an event which clearly shows how the culture ready for its downfall must be redeemed through a new culture. There's something very remarkable in there, because you can say, was it a mistake? You know, why did he let it happen? You know, why didn't he just stop it? And then Steiner says, no, the Hierophant deliberately let it happen so that something could be revealed, so that everybody could see that they were in a state of decadence, that actually the old forms could be revealed as empty in a way. So it's, you know, it's, without that, I have to say I was a bit in the dark myself, actually, until he kind of describes this situation. And then finally, you know, it's very interesting. So we've got these old forces, both in the factory and in ancient Egypt, that just want to go on with this old ritual. And there's no doubt that if only those old forces had gone on, in both places, actually, sorry to say, but we're doomed. I mean, we're either doomed back in the past or we're doomed now if just those old forces go on. And then it's very, very interesting, because we have this mistake, you know, this event which is absolutely not what was meant to happen, but where the Hierophant says truth has conquered. I feel the times approach already which will set free the individual I from out the spirit of the group. And there's this, I say this break, which is actually the kind of only hope for the future, and it's where something else comes in. I think I'm going to pass it over to James now, so that you've got enough. James has enough time to develop what he wants to say. You're muted, I think, James, eh?
Thank you for a very rich presentation, Richard. Very rich indeed. In a different context, I think we would open for a few questions and dialogue at this point, but I think probably under these circumstances we'll waive that and I will go on. There are many different ways I could take this theme further. But what is absolutely central to everything that this scene is depicting is how the sense of I can arise within the human being out of freedom and with responsibility. How can the I, the individual I, liberate itself from the universal I or the universal self from which we were all originally born and conceived, as indeed is described in the Old Testament, that the Elohim breathed the breath of life into the human being. And indeed, Steiner has built on that and has gone as far as to say that each one of us really is an individual thought of one of these Elohim beings. Quite remarkable to imagine that what each and every one of us has at the kernel of what makes us different from nature, that's the minerals, the plants, and also the animals, is literally the thought of a high spiritual being. But the destiny of each one of these thoughts is to discover the essence of thinking. Through the one thought that each of us has derived from this high divinity, we are given the possibility to actually discover and find the thoughts of every other human being so created. We have as many brethren, as many sisters and brothers, as human beings were originally created. And as far as I know, there may very well have been an actual given number. I don't know if one can say that, but I'm inclined to think that the number of beings who were generated with this creation had a certain boundary. And that we can imagine that when this boundary was approaching completion, the entirety of the spiritual cosmos, as this poured into each of these Elohim from the Godhead, becomes potentially manifest in a new creation. And this new creation one may call Project Humankind. And within this amazing project, of which we, each and every one of us, are exemplars, it seems as though the future of the Godhead in itself is also hidden. We are the children of God, but we are the children of God in whom God has invested his own destiny and his own future. And he has done this to bring something into the universe that wasn't there before. It was a risky business. I don't think that even the highest divinity of the Godhead, however we conceive of him, knew exactly every detail of that which was going to happen through this deed. I think that he knew some of its boundaries, but I think there had to be risk in this project, because without risk, human beings would not be able to achieve their very task. And this is a long job. This is a long process of evolution, which, as we know from anthroposophical cosmology, began to be prepared on old Saturn, old Sun, and old Moon, through first of all creating and building the bodily context in which this divine spark of individuality could live. And this bodily context was the word of the God in itself. Our bodies are not evil. Our bodies hold within themselves the highest stamp of divinity, because if they didn't, it simply would not be possible for this young child of self, this offspring of a thought of the Elohim, to find within incarnation, within embodiment, a reflection of the divine, the highest divine truth of the Logos, out of which we were all built and created. This body is what we have as the legacy of the spirit out of which we were born, and of the creative word of the universe itself. But this body has also become taken hold of by adversarial forces, as represented in these two sphinx that Richard referred to, the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic forces. And essentially, to the risk of oversimplification, the Luciferic forces tempt us to remain connected with an absolute morality. They tempt us to simply copy the morality of the Godhead out of which we are born. But in so doing, we lose touch with that very essential core of the gift with which the Elohim have bestowed upon us. But the Luciferic forces also are in many ways, in some ways, really guardians of truth. Lucifer has his place in the world and in the universe, but ultimately is asked to become the servant of a greater power. If Lucifer represents, in a certain sense, the wisdom of the world in its pure form, but not embodied, we have to lose that wisdom and rebuild it over and against the resistance of the body if something new is to be built. And the resistance of the body is largely, I think, though not entirely, provided by Ahriman, who has taken hold of the material world, who has crystallized out of this physical phantom of the Godhead a mineral body, which, being mineral and fixed, has inevitable limitations and has been, as it were, injected with certain conditions which run very contrary to the awakening of the spirit in the body. And yet it is only in the confrontation with these Ahrimanic forces in the body that we can forge our own real individuality and purpose. So we can perhaps appreciate that when the neophyte in the scene that Richard has depicted is looking down into his body and feeling drawn into it, that means to say he's being drawn into the bodily urges, into what in various contexts have been described as unworthy cravings, sense perceptions that can lead us towards addictive behaviors, self-gratification, jealousy, trust, power. All these forces in the body are very enticing because they create an inflated sense of self-identity. And it is essential for this baby self of each of us humanly to have to confront these forces and to a certain extent take them into ourselves in order that we can, on the one hand, gain a certain agency and self-confidence in order that we don't simply become replicas of the divine spiritual world, but that we, as is so clearly depicted in Goethe's Faust, we can only work through, by, with, and through being subject to temptation. And yet, these temptations of the body hold within themselves the greatest threats. And I think the times we live in clearly make the size of these threats visible to all, and they mustn't be underestimated. The threats are so big that there is a danger that the entire evolution of humankind could be subverted. Even Steiner did not give us any assurances in the face of the potential for evil that the threats of bodily incarnation may impose upon us. And yet, he also made it clear that only through exposing ourselves to evil could what he's called the consciousness soul or the spiritual soul faculty of humanity develop. You will probably, most of you, be aware that Steiner spoke of 3 levels of development of, let's call it for the moment, self-consciousness, but it's self-consciousness within the soul realm. It's not the consciousness of the I in her higher manifestation, which is still over and beyond what each of us can individuate. But it is the awareness of self within the incarnated body, within the soul. And the first level of this is the sentient soul, which is, if you like, the awakening of the I by, with, and through the emotional body or the astral body. And in the sentient soul, we have strong will. But this strong will is very much guided by our own bodily needs, by our own, self-actualization. We have within this soul a kind of, up to a point at least, legitimate egoism. But an egoism, if it simply proceeds on its own without a counterforce, would lead us ultimately into a kind of animalization. The I would become drowned within the desire nature and the cravings and all the rest of it of the astral body. But in order to protect us from this, something is then freeing itself during the course of biography from the etheric body. Something of the wisdom of the etheric body that derives from Old Sun, derived from the beings that Steiner has called the Kyrioteites, or the spirits of wisdom. I'm sure they have a Hebrew name. I don't know what it would be. But these spirits who gave us our etheric body on the old moon and who are designated as spirits of wisdom hold within themselves the one might call it perhaps the Sophianic mystery of the universe. They hold within themselves everything that can appreciate relationship and context, that can give the part a place in the whole and create coherence and cohesion. And these forces, as we develop and as we age, are freed from their natural place in the human body and become accessible to our thinking. To the extent that we wake up into these forces, then that little kernel of self that belongs to each and every one of us, that thought of the Elohim, is given through the etheric body, the context of the even higher spirits, the spirits of wisdom, through which it can orientate itself and begin to see its own individuality in the context of something much greater. And this endows us all with the gift of the rational soul. It's the gift of understanding, and I would say the gift of wisdom in the highest sense, but in its own limited way. If that is all it is, then it very easily is engulfed by Lucifer and is possessed by the human self and made into something, inflated into something that we're not yet ready for. One could almost say that this intellectual soul gives us the possibility for a certain kind of narcissism. We believe ourselves to be far greater than we are. We become messianic. And if that's all that happens, then we succumb to power. And I think what we are all aware of in the world today is that this is one of the greatest threats. You know, there is a lot of understanding or seeming understanding in the world that says we have to curb our own greed and our own lusts. Environmental concerns are understood perhaps more than ever before. Greed isn't sanctioned in the way that perhaps it was in the past. We realize we have to put a certain curb on around everything that we desire. But the very act of doing that can evoke in us a certain sense of power, and we can then all too easily become tyrannical in our use of power and subject ourselves to programs to which none of us has agreed, and to which, within which perhaps we may ultimately be deceived or become slaves. And we're all aware in different ways of how this is in so many respects these days. And this brings me back to this necessity to confront evil. Because only when we see the evil consequences of this particular, let's call it narcissistic or psychopathic approach to power and control and regulation, only when we see some of the consequences of that, are we able to meet another threshold, a much more profound threshold, a much deeper one, which we can't as yet fully master. And I think if I've got one thing to say about this next step, this next threshold into the realm of the consciousness soul, or the spiritual soul as Steiner has described it, I would say it has to do more with not knowing than it has with knowing. It has to do more with living with paradox and ambiguity than living with certainty. It has more to do with recognizing that sometimes good can serve evil, and sometimes evil can serve good. That a dualistic divide between good and evil is no longer quite so straightforward as it is within the domain of the intellectual or mind soul, but that we have to recognize that all of us is on the way to development, and that sometimes things have to go forward in a seemingly paradoxical way, that only through this agony and pain of not knowing and of seeming chaos is something else born. And you know, in anthroposophical circles, I always was under the impression, I don't know how this is with others, that people assumed that we had already achieved this level of consciousness soul development. And I think if there's perhaps one thing I discovered myself, at least I think I did, pretty early on, it's that we're only at the very beginning of this phase. In fact, the consciousness soul development only began in 1413, according to Steiner, if you nail it down to a date. And this period of development will last over 2,000 years. So we're only in we're something between a quarter and a third of the way into the time of the consciousness soul development. And more or less everything that we've seen happening on the world stage until now in all cultures can only really be seen as a bit of a repetition of a repetition. One can see a repetition of, well, perhaps even of ancient Egypt in the phase of European history that was acted out in the divine right of kings, which was only transcended 400 or 500 years ago, or even less. And the birth of what we now call parliamentary democracy can only be seen really as a repetition of what was attempted in Athens in ancient Greece. I gather it didn't get very far in Athens and ancient Greece. I gather that the true democracy that was attempting to be born in Athens very soon succumbed to power dynamics and other problems. But nevertheless, for a short period of time, something was able to incarnate there, and at least to some degree was able to act itself out further in the Roman incarnation, in the Roman era. And this has only really recapitulated, I think, in the last 400 or 500 years. I mean, whether you take it back to the Magna Carta or to Oliver Cromwell, these are only, it's all relatively recent. And we know that nowadays many people say we're in the post-democratic era because democracy has failed. An anthroposophical teacher of mine once said, the democratic process is nothing more than the human being's answer of being cut off from the spiritual world. Because there is no individual autonomy possible anymore. Therefore, we have to work with consensus. And this is absolutely right and necessary. And yet, the working with consensus still has to be overcome. And it has to be overcome by a new quality, a new capacity. And that is to really learn how to transcend the difference between each of us and recognize that despite difference, we have to work together. And I think we can only begin to do this in fairly small circles. But I think to the extent that we succeed in doing that, we can hope that we're contributing to what may also be taking place on the world stage. I become increasingly convinced that what we achieve with and in and amongst one another is not just separate from what's going on when hostages are released or when new presidents get inaugurated or anything else you care to mention. I think that we live far more than we realize at a spiritual level in a one world. And those people who may have the opportunity to be on the cutting edge of this new step of consciousness are contributing this to the whole of humanity, even if the work that they do is not directly or causally linked into the bigger picture. There are many more mysteries to be said about the consciousness soul, but it is an awesome step in development. And the very fact that it can only happen through the encounter with evil is enough said. And we are, in the course of our lifetimes, we've experienced this return. I'm not saying other earlier ages have never encountered this before, but I think it's never been encountered on the global level in the way that it is being now. And therefore, every single person, through the media and globalization, is challenged to find a new relationship to what is going on. We've seen this decades ago in South Africa with the truth and reconciliation endeavors that were brought about not only perhaps, but also mainly perhaps by Desmond Tutu, a religious attempt to really say that we have to adopt a different approach to punishment. We have to adopt a different view of how to deal with evil. And we have to begin with our human relationships, with our friends, with those who we are inadvertently always likely to be, to some degree, offending. And this leads me perhaps over into the final stage of my talk, which is going back perhaps to the essential nature of this embryonic I or self that is seeking to be born through the consciousness soul development of human beings. This consciousness soul requires a descent into the real physical realm. Another way of calling that is a descent into the mystery of the depths. The intellectual soul reveals the mysteries of the heights. The consciousness soul reveals the mysteries of the depths, which are very much the mysteries of evil, as this is bound up by the Ahrimanic forces that are at work in this otherwise divine body that we have been given. And I don't know how we receive, I don't think we receive a gift as yet from the physical body in quite the way that we do from the etheric body. The forces of the physical body remain much more bound to the body than do the etheric forces. They release themselves only a little. To the extent that they release themselves, and this is now the formative forces of the original phantom body, not the etheric forces, but the physical forces, to the extent that these forces release themselves, which is only fragmentary, at least until our death, we are given something of that higher strength through which we can find security of being in realms that originate far beyond the earth. And I use those words deliberately because they actually come from the 12th esoteric lesson of the first class of spiritual science that Rudolf Steiner gave. They're actually the words of the beings that to whom he's given the name of the archai, or the spirits of personality, they give us, when they are released from the physical body, and these are the beings, of course, that were originally conceived on old Saturn when our physical body was laid down. So they have a very particular relationship to the mysteries of the physical body. These beings, if this force frees itself from our body and we can find some spiritual relationship to it, they give us the capacity for security of being within our own being from realms far beyond the earth. And this possibility gives us hope that even amidst the most catastrophic physical destitution, we have a possibility through our spiritual heritage to be given the strength that we ourselves cannot create for ourselves in our young I, but which the archai, who are the forerunners of the experience of I from old Saturn, they achieved their I status on old Saturn evolution when the human physical body was forming. They can come to our aid and say, the I that we have had chance to develop is now available for you as a new security of being given to you from realms far beyond the earth. And this is the promise of the path of Michaelic development, which Steiner has given to us. But I think it's a promise that also has a precondition, which one finds certainly in some lectures that Steiner has given very explicitly. And what I'm thinking of is that he has said that by the time we achieve the level of development of the sixth post-Atlantean epoch, we're now in the fifth. This is the 1413 epoch of the consciousness soul is the fifth post-Atlantean epoch. And as Richard said, has got a reflection of what happened in ancient Egypt. By the time we reach the sixth in 1,000 or 2 years, then the experience of self will be totally different from what it is now. The experience of self that the neophyte in ancient Egypt felt in the longing to be drawn back into the body, the experience of self given through embodiment, the experience of self that we feel is bound to our skin, will, by the time the next epoch has dawned, really not give us any more our security of being. We will no longer achieve embodied security in the way that historically it has been given to us. Indeed, he goes as far as to say, if we only look into the forces at work in our own body, if we imagine that we ourselves are what's contained within our own skin, we will be profoundly disappointed. We will find in that the opposite of security. We'll find in our own embodied self an abyss of emptiness, an abyss of darkness. And that darkness will not be satisfied through the body any longer, but will only find its next step through a recognition that it is through an openness to the eye of the other human being that we will joining forces, as it were, not in a crude way, but through awakening to the being of the other, in a way that we begin to develop now, perhaps through unconditional positive regard, through what in psychology we tend to call empathic resonance, through the ability to leave our own skin, to see the world from the other point of view, from the other perspective, to disidentify even from the rights and wrongs of the consciousness soul, and say there is in the humanity of each and every one of us a transpersonal, a transcendent reality, then it's what I offer as a proposal is that in doing that, these archai beings can begin to speak to us. I don't know anywhere that Steiner has literally spelt that out, except in the imagination he's given to Waldorf teachers in the teacher's imagination, where the angels, the archangels, and the archai are all called upon in order that the teacher can gain an experience of the individual child, of the community that the child is in, if you like, the family, and ultimately the higher being of the child. Our higher being, our I, is only going to be given to us through the gift of higher spiritual beings. And in order to become available, our I has to develop the force of freeing itself a little bit from our physical body and holding that space open, not returning via a kind of umbilical cord to the spirit, as would have happened had that ancient Egyptian initiation followed its traditional course, not because it was given the right thing to say, but because it has somehow realized out of itself its need for help through grace. Because I don't believe the development of the I can happen in any way other than through grace. I think that perhaps this is something that could perhaps be more clearly brought forward within our own movement, that yes, discipline and rigorous development is needed in order to train the muscles of ourself in our bodies, and that in its own way, the rigorous meditative work, for instance, as Steiner has outlined in Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, is essential in order that we develop the muscles that we need, but those muscles will not of themselves lead to the next step. They will lead to an ability to hand over to a higher power consciously, and in the receiving, first from our fellow human beings, and then through them from higher spiritual beings, our new security of being will gradually emerge and will gradually appear. And maybe when Steiner was in the First World War was aware of what was going on with the troops in the trenches or wherever they were. I mean, Steiner was well aware of the hideous atrocities that were going on in that war, and which have gone on since in some ways maybe worse, but I think in the First World War they were already pretty lousy. Steiner knew that the confrontation of this meaninglessness was preparing all those involved in the war for their next stage of development, that they would be carrying across the threshold this sense of helplessness and despair and darkness, but that should not be conceived only as a disastrous failure, but as something which holds within itself, in however hideous and painful a way, the seed for the future. And unless we can grip into this fact with courage and develop the muscles to overcome the fears of this world, we won't take our next step forward. And I think all we can hope for is that the spiritual world will be looking on, will realize that we are being challenged, and will be seeking to be ever present for us, to give us help, strength, and sustenance, each according to our need. And that through this, the seeds of the community of the future to which we're all striving will live, and maybe in our individual life and relationships, we may begin to experience here and there a new light dawning, a new light of peace and acceptance that can lead the world forward eventually to fulfill its mission, its highest mission of becoming the 10th hierarchy.
Well, it was really inspiring, both of you, what you have done.
Nurit, we can't hear you. Nurit, we can't hear you.
I heard Nurit, but you didn't.
Just
My
a minute. Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay.
My question is if you know, if you normally have some conversation afterwards, any.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've got any response to what I've said, Richard, or whether what I've said has inspired you to add anything.
No, not really. I think that they I think it's how people hear them together, and I'd love to hear any comments or anything living in all of you. It's that would be great at the end.
Please unmute yourself and come speak. It was really inspiring. Yes, thank you. Udi, can we call you?
Well, thank you so much. I can try and formulate what I learned from out of what you said, or what I combined in my mind. Somehow you built a bridge for me between the not I talking in Samuel Beckett's word, the evil outside of myself, this phenomenon of referring to the evil as if it was something which is outside myself. I'm out of the game, but I'm not. It's not a not I, it's an I. My I is connected also with this evil. So the bridge between this and between this aspect of not knowing, of the fact that the conscious soul is not has not finished its development yet, and that I should be much less in a situation where I know everything about human rights and human rules, considering what is happening in the Near East now. The responsibility is on me as well as on the others. This is in short words what I heard behind your words, and I hope I did not interpret. It's not a wrong interpretation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Udi, very much.
We can't hear you, James.
I don't know why I went off. I didn't put myself off. No, I just said it's obviously far from a wrong interpretation. You know, I was able to find the words that I was able to find in the moment. And words are obviously altogether inadequate to describe this process of the I in relation to pain and suffering. And I know that very well. And I suppose if there's one thing that I've taken from the last years, it's that in so many ways, my own pain and suffering has increased. I've not been on a war front, but my exposure to what's been going on in the world has been unfelt. And yet I do feel that somehow I'm just that little bit more developed now than I was. And that's all one can hope for.
Well, I can see Pablo. Yes, welcome, Pablo. You want to speak? I see you wrote your question. Yeah, you did. Okay. You want me to read it? Okay. What role will trauma play in the development you outlined? Small question.
You say Trump.
Trauma. Yeah.
Trauma.
Sorry?
Was it, what role will trauma play?
Trauma, yeah.
Yeah.
Trauma.
In Hebrew, it's trauma.
Yeah.
Yes, it's trauma.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, terrible question.
I mean, to look at the psychological effects of trauma is I think, I mean, it's such a massive subject, and of course, trauma can dissociate and can separate us from our body, and that is how it normally works, and that is in and of itself. In and of itself, it's clearly a regression. But we now talk about, you know, post-traumatic growth. It's a new concept, I think, in the last years. And I don't want to expound on it, but perhaps it can be compared with something like addiction. You know, I think we all know that anyone who has come through an addiction has developed soul forces that perhaps are rather exceptional. And anybody who has managed to achieve post-traumatic growth will have done the same thing. But I don't think I'm either equipped or able in this context to put more flesh on that. Just stating the obvious, perhaps. I mean, you could say more yourself, Pablo, because you're probably much more equipped than I to address that. I don't know if you want to.
He's on the train, so...
Yeah, you're on the train somewhere.
I don't work in therapy at all, so I work in drama, so I can't offer anything on that level. But with this, just in relation to the scene I described, there's something, you know, there's so many things that are extraordinary, because the character of this Hierophant becomes in the present life a character called Capasius. And the character of Capasius has huge problems. He's met in the spiritual world, and someone comes to help him and says Capasius, and he says, "Don't say that name. I can't bear to have my name spoken." And then the person who comes to help says something about his eye, and he says, "You know, that's even worse. I can't have the word I spoken near me." And you know, it's someone quite wise said to me, "So if you were with the mystery dramas, how do you explain that this individual takes this huge step in relation to the I in ancient Egypt, and then in a later life can't bear to hear the word I. And, you know, I don't know the answer. We don't know what happened. It's quite possible that Hierophant would have been killed for the, you know, what he'd done. All the priests are saying he needs to suffer. And actually for myself, it was only when I got to the fourth play and worked with it, I was like, gosh, who's this Capasius? Because it's such a huge moment. When he steps forward, there's something, you know, really huge that enters the space. It's like, oh gosh, that's what's living in Capasius. And then at another stage, somewhere else in a scene in the spiritual world, he's told by one of his soul forces, I think, you have to reconnect with what lived in you in a significant life you led in the past. You know, you need to reconnect with those forces that you have. So I haven't got an answer, Pablo, to your question, but in relation to the scene, you know, it's interesting. There's like, we can do something wonderful, and we do have to face traumatic consequences from it. What do we do afterwards? You know, we have to sort of reconnect with that out of which we did what we did, or just suffer for quite a while, or keep growing. So that's my little response.
Richard, maybe you can speak about how to deal with the evil according to the drama mysteries.
Well, you know, that is an incredible thing, because that's how that's how Steiner's 4 mystery dramas end. As perhaps many of you know, you have a scene with Benedictus, the initiate, and Ahriman. It's a one-to-one meeting. And Ahriman tries to basically sidle up to Benedictus and pretend that he's a friend, you know, and I'm just trying to bring you help. And Benedictus says, you know, whoever you are, I don't know who you are, but whoever you are, you only serve the good if you will let yourself be completely known. And then Ahriman leaves and says, the moment that he can think me, as in truth I am, he will bring about a portion of that power which will eventually annihilate me. That's Ahriman. That if we know Ahriman, we will annihilate him. That's what Ahriman thinks. And when he leaves, Benedictus, the sort of knowing really deepens. I think talk about empathy, James. I think Benedictus actually knows Ahriman from inside. And from the inside, he says, this is an error. This is an error that Ahriman has carried for millennia, that human thinking is his enemy. And Benedict says, actually, it's only through him being known and recognized in all his disguises that he can eventually be redeemed, that he will find himself in the mirror of human thinking. Sorry if that's a bit long-winded for some people, but it's an incredible thing, because you know, it's the most extraordinary hopeful ending, even though it can seem bleak because we're faced with Ahriman. It's first of all about the ability to know him, the ability to recognize him in all his disguises, and that is what is redemptive for Ahriman. You know, we're often told, oh, you can't look too closely into things to try and understand what's actually happening. And the message is the opposite. It's actually that is redemptive, even if, you know, even if it's felt to be otherwise by powers that don't want to be seen through. So, you know, that's in the same play. It's very interesting, you know, actually what you get in that play, and that it leads to that. And that's actually what leads to the possibility into the future. You know, the Egyptian scene unlocks something, and then that deed of knowing Ahriman is what makes the future possible.
Yes,
but it's courageous. You know, part of our title was Courage for the Truth. It's you know, it's not an easy path, and Steiner keeps talking about thinking. Benedictus does. Right at the end, he's with Ahriman, and he says we have to be able to know him through thinking, and that is what will be redemptive in the end. So, yeah. It's very interesting, the meeting of the sort of therapeutic world here and sort of cultural world, dramatic world.
I think this is something that we are facing here in Israel since October 7th, that we need the courage to recognize the evil inside ourselves and not outside. As long as we will look only outside for the evil, it's a fallen initiation. We need the courage to recognize the evil that we are doing that inside ourselves. This is what I understand from what you are saying, all of you. And I think trauma forces us to meet the evil from inside. That's my thoughts.
To meet the evil from inside without any spiritual bypassing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any of the traumas today is moral injury traumas. So I think it's going with that. I hope you know this idiom.
Moral injury.
Moral injury trauma, yeah. But that you're not the victim, or you're not, you are the victim, yeah? That you are doing something unmoral to someone else and you got traumatized from this, you see?
From doing it, from
Yeah.
I think I think the greatest one of my traumas, and of course, you know, my traumas are minor in comparison with many, but I think one of my traumas is confronting the trying to find the words for it, really, the self-righteousness that appears in every single domain of life. I'm not even thinking specifically now of politics, although it includes that, but a certain self-assuredness that has got it's almost as though it's got sharp teeth. It's like confronting a spiky construct, and one hears this all the time in all the media, in all the newspapers, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, and it affects me as a kind of inner sneering, and being able to sustain myself in the face of that and not how shall I say, give it back in kind, not allow that to evoke an equal and opposite sneering reaction in me, but to be able to just hold the space open and say that's what it is. I think that's my challenge, and it may be a very small beginning in the face of traumas that we're otherwise going through, but I think that's been one of my starting points, particularly in relation to COVID, because of all the medical perversions that have been sent out into the world around this disease. You know, where does it come from? What's the nature of the virus? How dangerous is it? How transmittable is it? Will this, that, or the other medicine help, or should they be banned? You know, social distancing, social media closures, all the investment in these absolutes, most, if not all of which, have shown themselves to be at best half-truths and mostly lies, and then to confront the power of the lie within it all and the power of vested interests to pursue this. I think for me, this has been my growth curve over the last 4 years, and all of us will have had our own growth curves. Maybe on that note, we should call time. I think does that make sense, Eyal or Nurit?
Yeah.
May I ask last question before we finish?
You can ask and we'll see if it's possible to answer because of time, okay?
It was very interesting for me, the discussion, Eyal, that you brought about self when you get traumatized by hurting someone else. And I would like to know in a sentence, James, maybe, how do you find hope in this situation, that you feel this feelings of shame or blame, and you want to change the karma, but not always the karma is willing to be changed. How do you find hope?
Well, I'm sure you don't find it with any injunction, and I hesitate to offer anything. I don't know if I have the wisdom. I think that the finding of hope is part of a deep, deep, deep personal journey, plummeting the depths, sustaining a sense of hopelessness in the dark, and recognizing maybe that we're not alone. But we can't make that come about. We have to, in a way, submit to the unknown. And that's not an answer that, you might say that's not an answer that gives hope. But I don't think there is a recipe for hope. I think I'm going back to grace. You know, faith, hope, love are gifts of grace, which are there, but how they can dawn on us, we can't predetermine. I don't think we can develop the strength to be hopeful, but perhaps we can develop the strength to sustain our existence in those moments where hope fails, and perhaps thereby we will discover something greater about the nature of hope and ourselves. Maybe that's all I can say.
Well, on behalf of all of us.
That was a lot. Thank you very much.
On behalf of all of us, I extend
Steiner said to Berliner Freunde, to the friends in Berlin, sent a beautiful verse about hope. We can appeal to that, apply to that.
I know that verse. I don't know it off heart. I don't know it well enough to express it. But I know it's one of the most touching human verses Steiner ever wrote. So maybe it's something people can.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you all for your preparedness to attend, and it's been a
privilege. Sorry,
privilege.
it's been a privilege, really.
Yeah, on behalf of all of us, I extend our sincere thanks to you, James and Richard, for your engaging and inspiring lecture. So thank you so much. You uplifted our spirits. Thank you.